asked. Finished up chapter 16 last time. Matthew, that is. And I'm enjoying this study as we just go through the different questions that Jesus asked. I mentioned at the beginning of the class this originally, or at least the arrangement and putting together of it, the idea was my father-in-law, Roger Campbell, or Papa as we call him, but I just never had thought about doing a class where you just walk through the different questions that Jesus asked individuals. And I think we mentioned at the beginning, but that we're sticking to questions Jesus asked or addressed to people, not any questions, which I really think there's only maybe one or so where he's speaking to the Father. But we're going at it from that standpoint. But just an interesting idea for a class, an interesting idea for a study. And then I don't remember which way he did it first, but he also did a study one after the other, as I recall, or at least within close proximity of each other. And the follow-up study being questions people asked Jesus. And so there are a lot of those in Scripture. And it's a neat study because you cover a lot of different topics, but it's also, as I mentioned in the beginning, it serves good for lessons that are, they really can stand by themselves. So sometimes when you have a study that covers more than one quarter, you have teachers that are teaching one quarter, not teaching the next, or vice versa. And so it works well for that. And I don't know that we'll follow up necessarily with questions that people ask Jesus immediately. At some point, I do want to do that study. But both of these make for very interesting studies. And as I said, you just end up covering a lot of different topics. And so I like that. And I've really, really enjoyed this particular study. As I said, we finished up chapter 16 last week. And so we'll move into chapter 17 of Matthew this week. And of course, chapter 17 opens up with the transfiguration. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John. We're not told why he took only those three, as opposed to the rest of the apostles. He may have had them doing something that he told them to do. There could have been some other reason. We're just simply not told. We could speculate all day, I suppose, but we're just not told exactly why it was just those three. But those three go with him up onto the mountain. We're not told what mountain it was. Again, people will speculate, but we just don't know. And he is transfigured. and so, of course, we've studied this passage before. Peter, the apostles, they're afraid. They don't know what to say as he's transfigured. He becomes, clothing becomes white. I think it's maybe marked. It says, so as no fuller can whiten them. In other words, just whiter than you can even imagine. He's shining like the sun. They don't know what to say. And, of course, Moses and Elijah are there talking with him. So Peter, of course, speaks up. And he says, it's good for us to be here, Lord. Let's make 3 tabernacles. One for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. And then, of course, this cloud comes. And putting all the accounts together, they are in the cloud is the way one of the accounts puts it. I don't think it's here. No, here it just says the bright cloud overshadowed them. But they're basically in this cloud, and the voice speaks from heaven. This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. And after that, they only see Jesus. And so, of course, it's an emphasis of the authority of Jesus. And the next question we come to is coming down from that mountain, from the Mount of Transfiguration. So you get to verse 17. And really, I guess we need to back up to 14, because when they were come to the multitude, Matthew tells us, there came to him a certain man kneeling down to him and saying, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is lunatic, is the way the King James puts it, sore vexed. What's New King James got there? I didn't open up I usually get my, what'd you say? Epileptic. And that's probably more how we would say it, I suppose. And so he says, help my son. He's sore vexed. Oftentimes he falleth into the fire, oft into the water. I brought him to thy disciples, and they could not cure him. So you can imagine this father's concern, his dilemma, his distress, because here's his son that is, he's in bad shape. He's got a demon possessing him, and not just that would be bad enough, but sometimes it causes him to just fall into a fire or into water. So you can imagine where this being a situation where they got to keep eyes on him basically 24/7, right? Because you never know when that demon's going to do something harmful to him, and he's going to need somebody to help him out and to rescue him. But he says, I brought him to your disciples, speaking to Jesus, and they weren't able to heal him. So I think it's good for this one, and I told you before that we won't typically do this where if there's a question in Matthew and that same question is also in Mark or Luke or John, or if it happened to be in all three, I don't think there are any questions that are in all four gospel accounts. But if we have a question that is in one gospel account, we typically won't, come back and rehash that again. But sometimes there's enough of a nuance, a little slightly different account, and that's, we've talked before, they're not, sometimes critics will try to say these different gospel accounts are contradictory. Certainly not contradictory, but sometimes there are additional details given, and an addition does not a contradiction make, as one fellow said. But this is one of those where you get some additional information that is very helpful. So Mark chapter 9, let me get the exact verse. Yeah, Mark's account picks up with this, and of course he records the transfiguration as well through verse 13 of chapter 9 in Mark. 14 begins to record this account, Mark's account of this man whose son is possessed by a demon. So he's telling them, I brought, Mark's account, he says, I brought you my son. He brought his son to Jesus, in other words, but maybe the disciples who were the other 9 apostles, they're like, look, Jesus is away right now. What can we help you with? Maybe that's kind of their response. And he says, hey, they couldn't help. We learn from Mark's account, by the way, verse 17, it makes him, this spirit makes him mute. When it seizes him, it slams him to the ground is the way I'm looking at, let's see, that's New American Standard. I've got my app open here with like 4 different translations. I was trying to compare. New King James says, wherever it seizes him, it throws him down, foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, he becomes rigid. I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not. So Jesus, the question here that's in Matthew 17:17, it's in Mark 9:19. O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him hither to me. That's how it is in Mark's account. Here from the New King James in Mark, that's how it was. What I just read was Matthew's account. In Mark 9, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me. But here's the reason I wanted to go to Mark's account, because, let me get to the verse here. They brought him to him. I'm still in Mark 9. And when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. That's verse 20. So that's Jesus, of course. And if you have the red letters, of course, the red letters are not there by inspiration, but it's the he there is referencing Jesus. Jesus asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood. And often he has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. Of course, we read that in Matthew's account already. But listen to what he says. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And we've talked about this before. It's been a while probably since we mentioned this, but King James, New King James don't have it. Looks like ESV does. I was looking at American Standard does, and New American Standard does. Has the sense of this. Because when you look at, I don't know why I'm looking over here at Matthew, because Matthew doesn't record it he didn't record this particular statement. But if you look at, I'm just looking at New King James here. Jesus said to him, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. Now, has anybody got ESV or American Standard? So you notice it's different, right? There's the ESV and ASV has an exclamation mark after if you can. The way the New American Standard does it is more of, it's a question mark. Either way, I think you get the sense there. Because Jesus is not saying here, oh, well, if you can believe, all things are possible to him that believes. Because the Father said what? If you can help us, please have mercy on us. Have compassion. And Jesus, you know, it's almost like he's making a point. And it's not, you know, we've pointed this out for some of our other questions Jesus asked and how he answered those questions. It's not what I would call a rebuke, but it is at least kind of a reproof, because it's almost like, you know, we might go, if you can, all things are possible to him who believes. And again, I think either whether that's with a question mark or an exclamation mark, either way you get the sense. You know, even with an exclamation mark, he kind of says, if you can. Like, come on, man. If I can, if I'm able. My little kids all the time will ask me something. You know, say, Daddy, can we do such and such? And I'll say, it drives them crazy, and of course that's why I do it. But I'll say, well, you know, can is a statement of ability. And they'll say, may we, whatever, you know. And it's funny too, because they'll say, Daddy, can you take us, you know, like, Daddy, can you take us to the store? And I'll say, well, can is a statement of ability. Daddy, may you take us to the store? And I'd say, well, I don't think I need your permission. Dad, will you? So I sometimes have a lot of fun with that. But he says, you know, that was his question to Jesus, if you can help us. And Jesus is sort of scoffing and saying, if I can? You think this is a question of ability? And of course, you know, there were times people would come to Jesus and they'd say, I know you can help. If you choose, you can help us. And so he says, if you can. All things are possible to him who believes. And give the Father credit, because verse 24, still in Mark 9, immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. The way the King James records that is, help thou my unbelief. He says, I believe you're able. And I want to grow in faith. Help me. And so Jesus, he saw the people came running together, still there in Mark 9. He rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more. The spirit cried, convulsed him, came out of him. He became as one dead, so that many said, he is dead. Of course, Jesus takes him by the hand, lifts him up, and he arose. And then later on, the disciples are going to ask why they couldn't cast him out. But coming back to Matthew's account in this question, which again is very, very similar in Mark, I just wanted to go to Mark's account to get that statement from the Father and the answer from Jesus, because to me that's powerful. Jesus saying to him, you know, if I can. You think this is a question of ability, power? You going to say something, Robert?
Is that why Jesus started out his conversation with them, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? Because he knew what they were going to say.
Yeah, and I think that's, when you get to the actual question that we're looking at here, where he asked that question, I think that's the idea here, is that he's talking about there's a lack of faith here on the apostles' part. to some extent at least, because they're going to ask him later, why couldn't we cast him out? And that's his answer. But also the people. Yes, sir.
He said, help my unbelief. If he asks him, when he says help my unbelief, about he turns, he says, help my son, help me believe.
I think so. I think he's asking for help for his son, but also for himself. He realizes at least something's lacking there from the way Jesus answered. And it seems to me it's kind of a sort of offering a blank check. You fill in the amount, Jesus. Help me. I want to do what's right. I want to please God. He understands from Jesus' statement something's lacking in belief there, but he says, teach me. And so it seems, again, I think that's to the Father's credit. But that's an important additional little bit of information that we're given in Mark's account. And I think there's a lack of faith to some extent on the apostles' part. Seems like this statement is primarily toward the people, faithless and perverse generation. And I think we need to be careful that we don't have Jesus trying to apply that to everybody, because again, the Father here shows some real willingness and desire to learn, to grow in faith. But the idea here being there's at least to some extent a lack of faith. And his statement to the Father is indicative to some extent of some of the other people as well. But our generation struggles with faith as well, right? Maybe in different ways, different particulars, different details, but you got some who don't believe in God at all. Some claim to believe in God, but they don't trust in him. Some folks think believing in God is just talking about it, but they don't do anything. They don't lift a finger to serve God or try to follow God. But if you say, do you believe in God? Oh, absolutely. And I mean, we've all been around people like that. Maybe at some point in our lives been people like that. Some believe in Jesus, but they walk by sight instead of walking by faith. Paul says we walk by faith, not by sight, 2 Corinthians 5:7, but some folks do the exact opposite. They believe in a deity in that sense. They acknowledge him, but they're not really following him. So some people believe in Jesus, believe in God, but they live like the world, right? And so it's not like a struggle with faith is unique to that generation. This is something that continues to be a struggle throughout. And even among God's people, it can be a struggle, right? I mean, you see it here. Of course, Jesus is dealing with Jews here, so he's dealing with God's people. You see the same thing. Some believe in God, some are Christians, and again, they struggle with living like the world, right? Some people, they struggle even as Christians. They start to struggle with their faith. Well, is God real? And listen, I've talked to young people before, and by young people I mean even up 20s, 30s. But sometimes, I don't know the best way to put it. Sometimes young people they start to question things, and they start, well, do I believe in God? What about the concept of one church versus, this multi-denominational religious landscape that surrounds us? And they start wrestling with these things, and sometimes it really upsets the apple cart, as we say, and gets them disturbed. And I've tried every chance I get. I went through that myself, and same thing, it's kind of, it's like you begin to question everything. But that's not really a bad thing, is it? And what I tell every person I have a chance to talk to, young, old, or in between, that's not a bad thing as long as you come down on the right side of it, the biblical side of it, the logical side of it, where the evidence leads you. It's not a bad thing. In fact, it's a very good thing, because that's where conviction comes from. And a lot of times you see people that don't have conviction because they don't really believe. They're just on the coattails of mom and dad, or the coattails of whatever is what I've always done. It's just, sometimes it's habit, sometimes it's what I've always been taught. And they never stop to say, what do I believe? What if there comes a situation where somebody says, give me your Bible? You can't have that anymore. Or what if somebody says, you can't worship God anymore? Or you can't say things like homosexuality is wrong, or this is wrong, or that is wrong. Then what? Well, see, some folks, all folks that don't have conviction kind of say, well, okay. But when we're convicted, we say, I can't, I don't have to be ugly about it, but I say, I can't go along with that, because Acts 5:29, we ought to obey God rather than men. And so there's not a bad thing to wrestle with the stuff and to come out stronger for it. But struggles with faith it's not new, right? And that's what I'm trying to get at here. So Jesus says, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? And he's, again, I don't see this as much as a just scathing rebuke or something as we might be tempted to read it. It just seems like Jesus is saying, I've been teaching, I've been around for a bit. Of course, how long shall I be with you? His time on earth is limited. It's almost like, if you've ever been in school, some of our folks have been school teachers or are school teachers, and maybe sometimes a teacher gets frustrated and says, especially as those, what are the benchmark tests that they do now? They're kind of for checking to see if everybody's learning what they're supposed to at each level. What are those called? Or do they do those anymore? Common assessments, or you said it's called benchmarks too? Okay, so yeah, it's just checking to see. Well, sometimes as those draw closer, the teacher may be kind of going like, come on, y'all, everybody got to focus. We are running out of time for this test, and I don't want y'all just, failing this thing, or not getting this information that you need to be able to do well in this test. We're running out of time here. And so, it seems like that's part of what Jesus is saying, like, how long shall I be with you? Like, I'm not going to be here forever. Y'all got to listen up. I'm going to, my time here on earth is limited. But also he says, how long shall I suffer you? And that's an interesting question, because we could go on a whole other side trail, which we won't do. We'll resist that temptation. But talk about the long suffering of God. And so you see that when the guy comes up and says, well, if you can help, please do. And, I don't know. It's hard to know exactly where that guy's faith was. Sometimes we may say to somebody, some just, person that we think, well, they might help, they might not. They might be able to help, they might not. And so we just say, hey, man, if you could help me, could you help? And you're almost not even expecting anything, right? Is that possibly how this father was? Well, I've heard that you could do stuff, but I brought it to your disciples. They couldn't. If you can, whatever, just help us if you can. And Jesus goes, if I can? It's almost like, who you're talking to? Let me tell you something. If you believe, all things are possible to him that believes. And something kind of got the guy, because he's crying out in tears, Lord, help my unbelief. But it's an interesting question here in Matthew 17, and also, of course, in Mark 9. So Jesus rebukes the demon, and the demon comes out. I dare say that fella had faith, strong faith, going forward.
In place of the disciple, you read further down, it must have been a special demon, because he must have been an administration to it, because it said that, however, he was not allowed except by prayer and fasting.
Yeah, that really takes us to our next question, which is, right here in the same context. He says, of course, Jesus cast out the demon. The disciples they wait until they're, off to the side. You can sort of see them. They don't want to ask in front of the crowd. And they're sort of like, hey, Jesus, what's up? Why couldn't we cast this demon out? He'd given them power over demons, right? And Jesus says, because of your unbelief. Well, I mean, they did have some faith, right? Obviously, they're disciples of Jesus. But something was lacking there. And we've talked before, in fact, even in this particular class, levels of faith. Jesus sometimes says with the centurion all the way back in Matthew chapter 8, I've not seen so great faith, no, not in all Israel. He talks sometimes to the disciples. Some of the questions even was, O ye of little faith, why did you doubt? So there are levels of faith, but something here in this situation, this particular situation, was lacking. Of course, he says, verily I say unto you, I'm in Matthew 17:20, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you shall say unto this mountain, remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you. Howbeit this kind goeth not out but by prayer and fasting. And so, back to what Billy said, I don't know. It may be that there was something particular about this demon that, what did you say, was in the administrative field? I don't know. That's the question that I don't know that anybody can answer, really. How much of this was because this demon's kind of, a next level type of demon?
And he kind of said, well, hold on a minute, let me tell you, you're dealing with a little bit of a different character than what you've dealt with in the past.
Maybe so. And he does seem to say that, but he also says to them, hey, you couldn't do this because of your lack of faith. So,
Different caliber.
yeah, so I don't know. But it does kind of seem from the context like maybe this demon was a very powerful demon. And of course, again, why are miracles done, or were miracles done? To confirm the word. Now, they're also done out of Jesus' compassion for people that are hurting, people that are suffering, people that are in need. But don't ever forget, first and foremost, miracles were to confirm. And that even goes back to the Old Testament. Why did Elijah and Elisha do these magnificent miracles? It wasn't just, hey, let me show you something cool. It was to show, especially many times in a very idolatrous place. Elijah primarily worked where? In the northern kingdom of Israel. That was steeped in idolatry. And same thing with Elisha, who kind of took up the mantle, as we say. In fact, that expression comes from, I'm pretty sure, from Elijah and Elisha, because Elisha literally took up the mantle of Elijah. But Elisha, when he hears about this man Naaman in the Syrian army, who was a great man, powerful, a lot of military conquest, but he was a leper. And so the little girl says, oh, I wish my master was with the prophet that's in Israel. And so the king of Syria sends an entourage to the king of Israel, who gets angry about it. What am I, God? And Elisha says, hey, you send him to me, and you'll know that there's a prophet, there's a God in Israel. And his prophet, his servant, Elisha, you send him to me. And it wasn't about Elisha, but he says, you'll know there is a God, the God. And all your idols, they can't heal leprosy. They can't fix this, but the God of heaven can. And so he comes, and of course, we're familiar with the account of Naaman. But these miracles, they're done to produce faith, to confirm the message. And this demon, being stronger, perhaps it's an opportunity for Jesus to show the disciples, hey, sometimes you're going to have to have some extra strong faith here to deal with some of these situations. And again, I think there's an application there for us, not to casting out demons, not any kind of miraculous thing, but there are situations that are going to require a bit more, right? There are things that will challenge us. Maybe you have a guy cut you off in traffic or something, or somebody says something ugly or unkind at work or even within the church. But then there are other times when it just seems like, man, it's really a heavy, heavy burden. And sometimes it seems like every day is just a baptism of suffering, as it were. And that's going to require a little bit more. That's kind of, this kind goeth not out but by prayer and fasting. It's going to require a lot of prayer. It's going to require a lot of dedication. And we've talked before, New Testament never once commands fasting. Yet it does seem clear from various passages, this being one of those, that it's kind of expected. And that's something that is between you and God, between me and God. It's not something that I can bind on somebody else, but we know there is benefit in it. And it does seem that he just sort of naturally expects that his people at some point they'll be doing some fasting. And so maybe it's a situation where I'm dealing with a demon, not a literal demon possessing, but it may be a demon in the sense of a situation. It may be a demon in the sense of, not trying to call someone a demon, but maybe it's a difficult person in my life. There are situations where it's going to require a little bit more, right? So interesting thoughts there, a lot of good thoughts, and I appreciate y'all and various ones contributing, because this is a very interesting passage, and just from that one question, so many great lessons there. So Jesus goes on, again, still in that same context, and he foretells his death, resurrection. Son of Man shall be betrayed into the hands of men. Verse 22 of Matthew 17. They'll kill him. Third day he'll be raised again. They were exceeding sorry. And then we come to the next question. And, yeah, I said it's in the same context. It is, but it's really a different subject. So I guess before I move on with that, anything else on this question from 1717? Nothing? All right. So y'all, again, I appreciate lots of good contribution on that one, because that's some interesting stuff and interesting contributions that I didn't even have in my notes. So thank y'all. So we come to this again, in one sense, same context, but they come to Capernaum. And those that receive the tribute money, temple tax, we might say. In fact, is that how it is in, it is in the New King James temple tax? Okay. I lost there it is. Okay, I wanted to go back to Matthew, and I'm still learning this new app that I got. I like the ability to compare a bunch of different versions, but sometimes I find myself having to remember how to do certain things. So yeah, temple tax. So those that received the temple tax or the tribute money, they came to Peter, and they're like, you can sort of picture this. Jesus with Peter is just going to walk right on in. And so some of the people maybe they catch Peter. Say, hey, your master doesn't pay the temple tax? Y'all don't pay taxes? You're too good to pay the temple tax? It was kind of this was a Jewish thing. This was something that they expected. So you can almost picture, like, who do you think you are? Does he not pay taxes? Do you not pay taxes? So what does Peter say? Well, of course. Peter, impetuous Peter. So he says, yeah, sure, of course we pay taxes. He doesn't want any trouble. When he was coming into the house, when they come into the temple, Jesus prevented him, is the way the King James puts it. He went before him. And he says, and here's your question, next question from verse 25. What thinkest thou, Simon? And really there's a couple of questions here, just like with verse 17. What thinkest thou, Simon? This is Simon Peter, of course. Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Of their own children or of strangers? Well, it's a simple question. Do kings of the earth collect tax from their children or from citizens? Well, the prince in a kingdom is not exactly going to be paying taxes, is he? He's the son of the king. Well, Peter, he knows the answer. He's strangers. Jesus says, then the children are free. What's the point here, by the way? What's the point he's making? if the children don't pay tax, Jesus he's the Son of God. So why would he pay this temple tax? And it's really not about tax or about money. It's about making the point, driving home the point. He is the Son of God. And in fact, he follows it up immediately right there in verse 27. Notwithstanding, lest we should offend them. We don't want to cause somebody to stumble and think, well, I mean, look at Jesus. He doesn't even pay temple tax. And so he doesn't want to cause some kind of a stumbling block. He says, you go to the sea, cast and hook, take up the fish that first cometh up, and when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money, that take and give unto them for me and thee. But here, again, just really similarly to what we looked at in the question in verse 17, Jesus is trying to get people to think, to reason. And that's one of the reasons why I went to Mark's account with this child who was possessed by a demon, because that statement of Jesus, if thou can, if I can, he wants people to think. He wants Peter to think, well, if I'm the Son of God, that just follows. Why would you pay the temple tax? But again, it's not as much about money as it is driving home that point. Were you going to say something, Robert?
There's a period of time that Peter had to go fish, catch a fish, open its mouth, and come back, and it seems to be that Jesus was even giving Peter time to soak in what he said about the Son of God.
Yeah, I never thought about that. Robert was making the point that not that this would involve necessarily a lot of time, but there would be some time here that would pass for Peter to do what Jesus says, to go to the sea, cast in a hook, get a fish, find that coin, bring it back, and pay the temple tax. And maybe Jesus wants Peter to have some thinking time and to stew on this, as we say sometimes, and drive home that lesson. Maybe so. I never really thought about that. Because, there would be some time at least, not just a ton, but you got to go out and do that and then come back. And what'd you say? Well, we know they were biting that day. At least one was. So he says, put your hook in, first one. And when he's probably thinking about it a lot more as he comes back, and he finds it just like Jesus said. That's an interesting thought. Some time to think on it and really drive home that lesson, which no doubt it did. Anything else on that one? I was looking to make sure I had everything covered from that I wanted to say.
Very end, Jesus had just told him about his death and his resurrection. And all of him, Peter had probably in the garden and drew a sword into the Lord not die. And it seemed like Jesus was trying to help him prepare him for the end there, because he's one of the disciples that's going to have the biggest problem with Jesus on the cross.
Peter is a very interesting fellow. And I always say, to me, he's, of course, some of the apostles we're not given a lot of information about, but Peter is very relatable to me for a lot of different reasons. But, and I've mentioned before the television program, The Chosen, which is very good and for the most part very accurate. I've seen a few different things that were just a little bit off or whatever, but I've been really, really impressed with it. And I don't know, they sort of portray Peter how I picture Peter to be. I mean, he's very, and when you read about Peter in Scripture, he is, and this is one of the things that they get in that program, he's very defensive of Jesus. I mean, and that's not inherently a bad thing, but it's just a misunderstanding. And it's kind of like, it's kind of like every situation that arises, he wants to stand between Jesus and the people, or Jesus and that person, or Jesus in that situation. And even as you mentioned, Jimmy, right down to the Garden of Gethsemane. I mean, they've come to arrest him, and Jesus has told them 2 or 3 times or more what's going to happen. We're going to go, and the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of sinners and be killed and die. And he's even told them to raised again the 3rd day. But as soon as this thing starts happening, and you have to sort of picture when you put the gospel accounts together from the Garden of Gethsemane, we tend to read it and think of it all as happening like sequentially, but it's pretty clear when you put them together, there's some stuff happening simultaneously. You can almost see, because one gospel account records, Lord, shall we smite with the sword? And picture Peter, as that question is being asked, he's already swinging, and that's pretty much what we would expect from Peter, right? That's how Peter is. And, one disciple saying, hey, Lord, should we, you want us to, do we need to get ready to attack? And next thing you know, you turn around and the dude's missing an ear. But he's defensive, and it's like his heart's in the right place. He just was off sometimes. And that's why when Matthew 16, we talked about that when we were in chapter 16. And he says, far be it from you, Lord. You're not going to go and die, suffer and die. And he's like, get behind me, Satan. But that's Peter's, his heart's in the right place. He wants to defend Jesus. He just didn't always understand the spiritual nature. And Peter's the one that, we sometimes talk about. He says, I'll die for you. Sometimes it's easier, certain people, certain personalities, it's easier to die for the cause than to live. It's easier, and some folks, just the personality and how they are, it's easier to say, you know what, I will die for my faith. Okay, but will you live every day until you die for your faith or until you leave this life? And sometimes, really, for all of us probably at some point or another, sometimes that's the harder thing, right? And that you see that a lot with Peter. I don't have any doubt that, he drew the sword and he went to work. So it seems like he really was willing to die right there in the garden that night. But what about living for Jesus? And to his credit, Peter learned and he ends up living for Jesus. But sometimes it's easier to do that than to live, right? Good thoughts there. All right, so let's, I don't know if I want to get into the next question. The next question is in chapter 18. There's only one question in that chapter. 18:12. This is a quick, I don't know if I'd call it a parable, but how think ye if a man have 100 sheep and one of them be gone astray, doth he not leave the 99 and goeth into the mountains and seeketh that which is gone astray? It's a familiar statement. It's a familiar illustration. The context is dealing with who is greatest in the kingdom, and you see that debate that they had before that. And he asked this question. Again, he's expecting some reasoning power, some thinking, and he's talking about doesn't want sheep to perish. Doesn't want anybody to perish. Who's greatest in the kingdom, they ask, verse 1. Jesus calls a little child. He says, you need to become like a little child. Humble yourself as a little child. That's the greatest in the kingdom. Whosoever receives one such little child in my name receiveth me, verse 5. Whoever offends one of these little ones which believe in me is better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. We've talked before, they had little bitty millstones that a woman might use in her kitchen to grind up some meal, some wheat, for some wheat grain for her family, or barley grain for her family to make some bread for them. But then there were these big giant millstones, right, that were kind of the industrial size. That's what Jesus is talking about, having hanged about your neck. But he says, woe to the world because of offenses. It must need be that offenses must come. It must needs be that offenses come. But woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. And, of course, he goes on to talk about if your hand or foot offends you, if your eye offends you. The Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. Everybody is important to God, and that's kind of the idea here with this question. If a man has 100 sheep, would he not go astray? One goes astray, would he not leave the 99 and go look for the one that had gone astray? And, when it comes to seeking lost sheep, that's why Jesus came. Of course, Luke 19:10, the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. That's why he came. Seek for those who have wandered away. That's his mission, must be our mission And that's why we talk so much about evangelism. Even if it's someone within the church, if somebody's overtaken in a fault, go, seek them out, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, Galatians 6, 1 and 2. And then, of course, we learn from passages like Ezekiel 34 and others, the shepherds lead the way in finding lost sheep. And we talk a lot about that. And that's why the elders encourage and admonish the congregation, because the shepherds lead the search for lost sheep. And, of course, the joy of finding a lost sheep is right there in verse 13. If so be that he find it, verily I say unto you, he rejoiceth more of that sheep than of the 99 which went not astray. It's not that he loves one more than the other, but when something is lost and it is found, that is cause for rejoicing, cause for celebration. And nowhere is that seen more clearly than in the parable of the prodigal son. All right, we'll stop there and we will pick up. That's, as I said, the only question in chapter 18, so we'll go into chapter 19 and pick up with our next question there, God willing, next week. Thank y'all very much. I appreciate the comments and good thoughts today.